Welcome to this journey into one of the most horrifying accounts buried in the history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin the story, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are building a record of where and when these documented accounts travel across the world. The year was 1903. In Shannon County, Missouri, a series of vanishings began that would never be explained. At first, the record spoke only of disappearances. A trapper, a physician, two logging brothers, and finally a shopkeeper. But what those official lines failed to describe was far more disturbing than anything they contained. This is the story of the unsolved mysteries that still haunt the Ozark Mountains. October of 1903 began like any other in Shannon County, Missouri. The air turned crisp, the leaves along the ridges shifted to copper and scarlet, and the loggers prepared for the long winter ahead. It was a season of routine, when hunters laid their traps and families stored away grain. But for one man, and for the community around him, the routine would never return. His name was Elias Woodward. A trapper in his late 40s, he had spent much of his life in the Ozark wilderness. He was known for his steady hands, his sharp aim, and his almost uncanny knowledge of the forest. Elias was not a man who made mistakes in the woods, which is why his disappearance would mark the beginning of something much darker. On October 14th, a mail carrier named Thomas Whitley diverted from his usual route. Heavy rains had flooded the lower crossing, so he took a narrow ridge road that wound through the timber. Along the way, he noticed smoke that seemed to curl faintly from the chimney of a small cabin. Curious, he approached. The cabin door was ajar. Inside, the scene was eerie in its ordinariness. A pot of stew sat cold on the iron stove, its surface coated with grease from having cooled untouched. A tin cup rested beside a loaf of bread, half sliced, as though the man had stepped away for only a moment. Nothing was overturned, nothing was broken. The bed was neatly made, blankets smoothed across the frame, yet the cabin was silent. Elias's rifle still hung above the fireplace. Locals knew he never went anywhere without it. His traps, usually carried in a sack on his back, leaned against the wall unused, and on the table lay his journal, open to a page with words that unsettled even hardened men. The last entry, written in a steady but urgent hand, read, "They are moving through the hollow again tonight. The sound is different this time." Whitley backed away from the cabin and hurried into town to report what he had found. Within hours, Deputy Marshal Fleming gathered a search party of 10 men. They swept the forest for 3 days, calling Elias's name, combing the ridges and hollows, and scouring the creeks for any sign. They found nothing. No boot prints, no torn clothing, no struggle. What made the case disturbing was not simply that Elias was gone, but that everything he owned remained behind. A man might abandon his home, but not his weapon, not his traps, and not his livelihood. His journal suggested he feared something, yet no one knew what "they" meant. Theories quickly spread. Some claimed panthers had dragged him off, though there was no blood, no carcass, no trace of violence. Others whispered of moonshiners in the hills, ruthless men who eliminated anyone who stumbled too close to their hidden stills. But the locals who knew Elias best dismissed those explanations. He was cautious, armed, and too experienced to be ambushed so easily. There were those, however, who spoke of Baker's Hollow, a dark stretch of woods not far from the cabin. For years, hunters had muttered of strange sounds, their echoes that did not belong, voices when no one was near, and shadows that seemed to move against the lantern light. The entry in Elias's journal convinced many that he had heard them too. When the official search was finally abandoned, the cabin was left as it was found. Over time, weather reclaimed it, but the story never left the valley. Elias Woodward's disappearance was recorded as unsolved, yet it was only the first in a chain of vanishings that year, a chain that would build into one of the darkest mysteries in the history of the Ozarks. Barely 3 weeks after the disappearance of Elias Woodward, Shannon County was shaken again. This time, it was not a solitary trapper who vanished, but the community's only doctor. His name was Dr. Samuel Hawthorne, a man respected for his skill and admired for his dedication. When a neighbor's child fell ill, or when an injury threatened a farmer's life, it was Hawthorne who rode the rough back roads to bring comfort. He was known to travel miles through storms, lantern in hand, determined to reach his patients, which made his sudden disappearance all the more alarming. On the evening of November 3rd, Dr. Hawthorne was called to the Jenkins farm, roughly 12 miles northwest of Eminence. The matriarch of the family, an elderly woman weakened by fever, had worsened, and they sent a rider for the doctor. He arrived just before dusk, examined her carefully, and provided what medicine he had. The family later testified that he appeared calm, confident, and in good spirits as he mounted his horse for the return journey. He told them he planned to be back in Eminence before dark. He never arrived. 2 days later, Hawthorne's horse returned to town without him. The animal was drenched in sweat, its eyes wide and restless, as though it had been driven hard and frightened nearly to death. His saddlebags still hung from the saddle, filled with medical instruments and vials of medicine. Nothing had been stolen. A search was organized immediately, with dozens of men scouring the trails between the Jenkins farm and town. Along the road that cut near Baker's Hollow, they found only one clue. Lying in the dirt was Hawthorne's pocket watch. The glass was unbroken. The chain had not snapped but appeared carefully unclasped, and the hands of the watch had stopped at precisely 5:17. The discovery chilled the searchers. If it had been an accident, why would the watch be found on the road, unharmed? If it had been foul play, why was the horse left alive and the saddlebags untouched? No boot prints surrounded the watch. No broken branches hinted at a struggle, just the ticking silence of the hollow. Baker's Hollow already carried a reputation. Hunters swore that echoes rang differently there, sounds carrying farther than they should, or vanishing altogether into the trees. A few claimed that if you lingered long enough, you might hear voices calling, some in whispers, others in clear tones, though no person could be found. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, the sort of stories rural communities trade to keep children from wandering too far. But when the only doctor for miles vanished in the very stretch of land those legends warned about, the whispers grew louder. The official report was maddeningly brief. Physician failed to return, presumed lost. That was all the county clerk recorded. Families who had depended on him for years were left without answers, and the valley without a doctor. Yet many in town believed the officials had stopped looking far too soon. They said the searchers had avoided the deepest part of Baker's Hollow, unwilling to spend too much time under its shadow. The disappearance of Dr. Hawthorne cut deeper than that of Elias Woodward. A trapper lived at the edges of society, and though his absence unsettled the town, it did not touch every life. But the loss of the physician struck at the very heart of the community. It was no longer a question of one man wandering too far or succumbing to misfortune. It was a question of what was stalking the Ozark woods. By winter's first frost, 2 men were gone. Both experienced in their own ways, both vanishing without trace. The journal of one had hinted at voices. The watch of the other stopped at an exact moment. For the people of Shannon County, unease turned into dread. And they were right to be afraid, because the disappearances had only just begun. The winter of 1903 had settled hard over Shannon County. The ridges were white with snow, the streams ran slow under a skin of ice, and families kept their lanterns burning long into the night. Yet even in the bitter cold, men still worked. Timber was money, and the Ozark woods were filled with trees that promised wages. Among the loggers that season were the Thornton brothers, Jacob and Silas. Both were young men, strong and stubborn, raised in the hills. They were known for their endurance and for taking risks that older men avoided. Where others kept clear of Baker's Hollow, the brothers cut straight through it, hauling timber along its frozen paths. Neighbors warned them, telling stories of Elias Woodward's journal and Dr. Hawthorne's vanished horse, but the brothers laughed it off. Ghost stories, Silas said. Nothing more than wind and shadows. On December 10th, the 2 set out before sunrise, sled and mules, harnessed to carry the day's cut. They were last seen at the edge of the hollow, axes slung across their shoulders, smoke from their breath hanging in the air. When the sun dipped below the ridge that evening and they had not returned, families grew uneasy. By dawn the next day, a search began. The sled was discovered first. It stood abandoned on the narrow trail, the mules still tied in place, shivering in the cold. The harness was intact. The load of logs was half stacked, as though the brothers had paused midway through their work. The tracks in the snow told a story. 2 sets of boot prints led a short distance away from the sled, then stopped. Not faded, not scattered. Stopped. Beyond that point, the snow was undisturbed. Men stared at the prints in disbelief. It is as though they vanished into the air, one searcher later said. The snow was smooth for yards in every direction. No marks of struggle, no blood, no sign of retreat. The trail ended as though Jacob and Silas had simply ceased to exist. More unsettling was what the searchers found in the sled. Beneath the logs, wrapped in a piece of cloth, lay a small wooden cross. It was carved roughly, the edges jagged, as though whittled in haste. Neither brother was known for carving, nor for carrying such things. The cross looked older than the fresh marks on it suggested, as though it had been passed through other hands before ending up beneath their load. The men who found it argued over its meaning. Some said it was a sign of desperation, a prayer carved in fear just before the brothers disappeared. Others whispered it was not theirs at all, but placed there by whatever had taken them. The official report stated only that Jacob and Silas Thornton were presumed dead, bodies unrecovered. But the story spread quickly. For the first time, two men had vanished together, experienced woodsmen who had mocked the fears of others. Their laughter had been silenced, and in its place remained only silence and the carved cross. The community's fear deepened. One disappearance could be dismissed as misfortune. Two could be stretched into coincidence. But four men, all gone in less than 2 months, each under circumstances more baffling than the last, could not be ignored. By the end of December, families who lived near Baker's Hollow no longer allowed their children to play outside. Lanterns burned in every window after sunset. Men who once hunted confidently now traveled in pairs, their rifles never far from reach. And still, the question hung heavy in every cabin. What had taken the Thornton brothers, and why had their tracks ended in untouched snow? The winter cold could explain many things, but not this. By January of 1904, Shannon County was already living in fear. The trapper, Elias Woodward, Dr. Hawthorne, and the Thornton brothers had all vanished without a trace. Families locked their doors earlier, children no longer roamed the pastures, and even the toughest men refused to walk alone into Baker's Hollow. Yet the terror was not finished. It was about to strike in a way that broke every remaining sense of safety. Her name was Miranda Hollis. She was the wife of a shopkeeper in Eminence, known for her kindness and her habit of delivering parcels of food to neighbors in need. Miranda was not reckless, nor one to wander far. On January 15th, she set out with a basket of bread and dried meat for her cousin, who lived less than 2 miles from town. It was a familiar route, a straight path along the river, one she had walked many times before. She never returned. When her husband realized she was late, he assumed she had stayed to visit. But as night fell and there was still no sign of her, he raised the alarm. A group of men took lanterns and walked the river path. Less than a mile out of town, they found the basket she had carried. The bread remained inside, the cloth cover still neatly folded. But there was no sign of Miranda. The snow that lined the path was undisturbed. Her boot prints trailed neatly from town until they simply ended, just as the Thornton brothers had. Searchers spread into the woods, combing every hollow, calling her name until their voices cracked. They found nothing. One detail unsettled them most of all. Near the place where her tracks stopped, pressed into the snow, was the outline of a hand. Not a handprint in dirt or mud, but a perfect impression in the snow, as though something large and heavy had pressed down only once before vanishing. The fingers were long, the palm wide, far larger than any human hand. The snow beneath was frozen hard, not melted as it should have been by warmth. The men who saw it swore it was no trick of light. It remained visible until the wind carried fresh snow across it, and then it was gone. Miranda's disappearance shattered what little calm remained in town. Until then, some had consoled themselves that the victims had been men, woodsmen, wanderers who perhaps had stumbled too far into danger. But Miranda had been close to town, on a well-trodden path in daylight, and she had vanished as completely as the rest. Whispers spread that whatever haunted the hollow was no longer confined to the forest. It was moving closer, reaching for those who thought themselves safe. Mothers clutched their daughters tighter. Men who had once dismissed their wives' fears now barred windows and nailed shutters. The official record again gave no comfort. It listed Miranda as missing, presumed dead, with no further details. But in the homes of Shannon County, her name was spoken in hushed tones, and her fate became a warning. No one was beyond reach, not in the woods, not on the roads, not even within sight of town. By the end of January, Shannon County was no longer just frightened, it was broken. The disappearances had become a pattern too clear to deny. 4 men, and now 1 woman, all gone without explanation. And every clue that remained, the journal, the pocket watch, the abandoned sled, the strange handprint, hinted at something beyond the understanding of the time. The Ozark woods had become more than a landscape. They had become a predator. By February of 1904, Shannon County was no longer the same place it had been only months before. The disappearances of Elias Woodward, Dr. Hawthorne, the Thornton brothers, and Miranda Hollis had changed everything. The valley that once lived by the rhythm of farming, trapping, and logging now moved to a different rhythm, one set by fear. What marked this period most was not another sudden vanishing, but the silence that fell over the community. It was a silence heavier than snow, pressing into every cabin and every field. Children no longer played by the riverbanks. Men no longer sang while they worked their saws in the timber. Even the church bells, once a source of comfort, seemed to toll into emptiness. Neighbors who had once shared meals and stories grew suspicious of one another. They locked their doors earlier each evening, lamps flickering behind shuttered windows. The sound of a dog barking in the night would stir entire families awake, rifles gripped tightly, hearts racing. More often than not, nothing followed. Yet the silence that returned was worse than any noise. The forest itself seemed to reflect the change. Hunters spoke of ridges where birds no longer sang, hollows where no insect hummed. Entire stretches of woodland were described as lifeless. No deer tracks crossed the snow, no rabbit trails broke the frost. Even seasoned woodsmen admitted the Ozarks had grown unnaturally quiet, as though the land itself was holding its breath. Fear seeped into the smallest details of life. Mothers warned their children never to linger near the tree line, even in daylight. Fathers refused to let their sons fetch water alone. Lanterns burned longer each night, their light more a prayer than a shield. Families sat together in silence, listening, waiting, bracing for sounds they hoped never to hear. The preacher attempted to rally his congregation, urging them to find strength in faith. But each Sunday, fewer and fewer people arrived. The long benches sat half empty, then nearly deserted, until finally the bell rang to call a church that no longer gathered. People chose to pray at home, where they felt the comfort of walls and the closeness of kin. Some families packed their belongings and left entirely. They abandoned cabins, fields, and even livestock, unwilling to spend another night in a place they now believed cursed. Others stayed, bound by land and blood, but they did so like prisoners. The roads grew deserted, the nights stretched longer, conversations turned to whispers, and even laughter seemed dangerous, as though it might call attention from something watching. Dogs grew strange during this time. They paced restlessly at doors, ears pressed flat, or sat for hours staring into the woods with low growls. A few refused food. Some wandered into the trees and never returned. Those that stayed no longer barked to warn their masters. Instead, they whined quietly, as if they too feared the silence. The official records of this winter list no new disappearances. But the absence of bodies did not mean an absence of horror. The community was hollowed out, its spirit broken, its voice muted. What haunted Shannon County was no longer only the vanishing of neighbors, but the dread that lingered after. By spring, the silence had become unbearable. It was not peace. It was suffocating, alive, pressing into every corner of life. The people of Shannon County were learning a truth more horrifying than any single disappearance. The forest did not need to take another victim to claim power. Its silence was enough. By the spring of 1904, the fear in Shannon County had spread far beyond its borders. Newspapers in St. Louis and Springfield carried short pieces about the vanishings in the Ozark Hills. Most reports were brief, almost dismissive, treating the stories as local gossip or exaggerated frontier legends. Yet one man took them seriously. His name was Professor Jonathan Kincaid. Kincaid was an academic from Chicago, a lecturer in natural history with a fascination for folklore. He had traveled through the Appalachian Mountains collecting stories of witches, haints, and strange lights in the hollows. When he read of the Ozark disappearances, something compelled him to investigate. To the people of Shannon County, he was an outsider, a man of books and theories. But to himself, he was determined to bring reason to the mysteries. He arrived in Eminence in early April, carrying a leather satchel of journals and instruments. Locals described him as tall, thin, and sharp-eyed, with a voice that carried a confidence many found unsettling. He asked questions that no one else dared. Where exactly had the Thornton brothers' footprints ended? What words were in Elias Woodward's final journal entry? How far had the watch of Dr. Hawthorne lain from Baker's Hollow? Most townsfolk were reluctant to speak. They had already buried the matter in silence, fearing that talking too much might invite more horror. Yet a few, desperate for answers, guided him to the sites. He walked the path where Miranda Hollis had vanished, pausing for long stretches of time, as though listening. He traced the edges of Baker's Hollow, sketching the ridges, marking places where echoes warped strangely. He even camped near the old cabin of Elias Woodward, keeping notes late into the night. What he wrote disturbed those who later read his journals. He noted that the forest grew unnaturally still at certain hours, not only of night but also of day. He recorded that the cries of owls bent oddly in the hollow, as though the sound curved back upon itself. He claimed to see faint lights moving among the trees at dusk, pale glimmers that flickered and vanished when approached. Kincaid's presence divided the community. Some found hope in his calm, scholarly approach, believing that perhaps he would explain what had taken their neighbors. Others feared he would only stir whatever forces haunted the valley. Old Abigail Moore, the elder who had long warned that the woods were restless, told him directly, "You cannot reason with what walks here. It does not care for your notes." Still, Kincaid pressed on. He interviewed every family touched by the vanishings. He collected fragments of abandoned belongings, scraps of cloth, and even a small wooden cross said to have been found in the Thorntons' sled. He stored everything in his satchel, treating each piece as though it were evidence in a trial. One night in late April, Kincaid gathered several men in the tavern and shared his first conclusions. He did not believe the vanishings were random. He argued they formed a pattern, circling Baker's Hollow like the points of a compass. Elias to the north, Hawthorne to the west, the Thorntons to the east, Miranda to the south. In the center, he said, lay something no one had yet uncovered. The men listened in uneasy silence. Some scoffed, accusing him of drawing maps where none existed. But others felt a deeper chill. The disappearances had already seemed connected in ways they could not name. Hearing it spoken aloud gave weight to their worst suspicions. Professor Kincaid promised he would find answers, but the people of Shannon County, already broken by fear, wondered what price his search would demand. For in the Ozark woods, patterns rarely ended with discovery. They ended with disappearance. When Professor Jonathan Kincaid arrived in Shannon County, one of the first items he requested to see was the journal of Elias Woodward. Many in the community remembered the final words that had been written inside, the cryptic note about movements in the hollow and sounds that were different this time. But most had never looked beyond that chilling entry. The journal had been kept by Deputy Marshal Fleming, locked away in the county office. The deputy had guarded it carefully, unwilling to let the disturbing words fuel further panic. Yet, when Kincaid insisted, Fleming reluctantly handed it over. What Kincaid found inside convinced him that Elias had left more than a warning. He had left a record of something that had been stalking him for weeks. The early pages were ordinary enough. Elias wrote of the weather, of the pelts he caught, and of his daily meals. He recorded the names of buyers in town, the prices of fox skins and beaver. But as the pages turned, the tone began to shift. In late September of 1903, Elias began to write of noises in the woods that did not belong. Low moans at dusk, sharp cracks of branches at midnight, sounds that seemed to circle his cabin, drawing closer each night. By early October, the entries grew more fearful. He described seeing pale flickers between the trees, like lanterns swaying where no man walked. He mentioned shapes at the edge of his vision, taller than men, but gone when he turned his eyes. One entry stood out in particular. He wrote, "The silence is worse than the noise. It waits, it watches, it holds the night until I cannot breathe." Kincaid copied passages into his own notebook, circling the words about silence and movement. He told Fleming that Elias had been documenting a pattern, not suffering from delusion. The trapper had been skilled, grounded in reality, yet his words showed fear that no seasoned woodsman would have invented without cause. Toward the final days of the journal, the writing grew hurried. Elias noted scratches on the trees near his cabin, marks higher than he could reach with his axe. He wrote of his traps being sprung, not by animals, but left empty as though something had toyed with him. His last complete entry was the most disturbing of all. "Voices in the hollow tonight, not words I know. They call, and the trees answer." The unfinished line on the final page was already known to the townsfolk. "They are moving through the hollow again tonight. The sound is different this time." But Kincaid emphasized that the line was not the first mention of strange presences. It was the culmination of weeks of escalating signs. When Kincaid presented his findings to the men of the town, their unease deepened. Many had assumed Elias had wandered too far or met with human violence. To hear that he had documented lights, voices, and unnatural silence for weeks suggested something else entirely, something intelligent, something deliberate. Some dismissed the journal as the ramblings of a lonely trapper, but Kincaid was not convinced. He told the townsfolk that Elias Woodward had been hunted, and if his words were true, then his disappearance had been inevitable. The journal remained one of the few tangible records in the case, but in Kincaid's hands, it became more than a curiosity. It became a map of fear, pointing again and again to Baker's Hollow. And with that discovery, Kincaid resolved to press deeper into the woods, no matter what others warned. The people of Shannon County whispered among themselves. Elias Woodward had written of being watched. Now, they feared that Professor Kincaid, with his questions and his maps, had drawn the same gaze upon himself. The Ozark Mountains are honeycombed with caves. Some are narrow fissures that swallow only a single traveler, while others stretch for miles underground, winding through limestone and echoing with dripping water. Locals used them for shelter in storms, and children dared each other to creep into the first few feet before turning back. But by the spring of 1904, no one in Shannon County looked at the caves the same way again. Professor Jonathan Kincaid, still convinced that Baker's Hollow held the key to the vanishings, began asking questions about caves near the sites of the disappearances. Several men reluctantly admitted that there were openings scattered across the ridges, some too deep to explore, others avoided entirely. Hunters had long told stories of strange air currents rushing from certain cracks in the stone, carrying with them sounds that did not belong to wind or water. Kincaid persuaded a small group to guide him to one of these openings. It lay in a ravine not far from where the Thornton brothers had last been seen. The entrance was narrow, no more than a crawl space at first, but widened into a chamber where light from a lantern revealed glittering mineral walls. The men who accompanied him refused to go farther. They claimed the air carried a smell of rot, faint but undeniable. Kincaid pressed on alone. In his notebook, later recovered, he described the chamber as colder than the air outside, with silence so complete that his own breath sounded deafening. As he moved deeper, he noticed scratches along the stone. They were not marks of tools, nor the scrapes of animals. They were tall, vertical gouges, reaching higher than a man could stretch. The professor sketched them carefully. His notes described them as deliberate, as though something with claws had dragged along the stone again and again. Stranger still, the gouges glistened with moisture, though the surrounding rock was dry. He touched them with his fingers and found the liquid sticky, clinging to his skin like sap, though it carried no scent he recognized. Farther in, he recorded something more unsettling. He wrote that he heard faint tones, not echoes, but almost like voices humming. The sound rose and fell, sometimes close, sometimes distant, as if the walls themselves were breathing. He called out once, his voice trembling against the silence, but the humming only paused before continuing. Kincaid returned to town pale and shaken. Though he spoke with confidence to the men at the tavern, his journal betrayed his fear. He wrote that the cave was not empty, that the scratches and the sounds proved presence. And that presence, he insisted, was connected to the disappearances. The townsfolk who heard his account were divided. Some insisted he had simply frightened himself in the darkness, mistaking natural acoustics for something sinister. But others whispered that his words confirmed what they had always feared. The caves were not lifeless. They were passages, and perhaps something moved within them. In the weeks that followed, children reported nightmares of voices echoing under the ground. Farmers claimed they felt vibrations in the earth as they plowed near the hollow, as though something stirred far beneath their feet. And hunters began to avoid not only the hollow, but every cave mouth in the valley. The official records never mentioned Kincaid's cave expedition. To the county, the disappearances remained unconnected tragedies, but to those who listened, the professor's notes deepened the terror. If the woods had already swallowed 5 lives, perhaps the caves beneath them were not simply hiding places. Perhaps they were the source. By the end of spring, Shannon County no longer feared only the forest above. They feared the darkness below, and the question of what might be waiting in it. The spring of 1904 brought new unease to Shannon County. The caves had revealed their secrets to Professor Kincaid, and his words spread quickly, deepening the fear. But for one family, the McClintocks, the horror came not from the forest or the hollows, but from within their own home. The McClintocks were a well-known family in eminence. Robert McClintock owned a small mill on the Jacks Fork River, and his wife Ellen kept a tidy home filled with trinkets passed down from her parents. Among these possessions were 2 mirrors, tall and framed in dark oak, that had stood in the family parlor for as long as anyone could remember. They had been heirlooms, beautiful but unremarkable. That changed in April. Ellen first noticed it late one night. She had risen to tend the fire and, passing through the parlor, glanced at the mirror. She swore she saw movement behind her reflection, a flicker of pale light drifting in the glass. At first, she blamed her tired eyes, but when she leaned closer, the light did not vanish. It pulsed, faint but steady, as though something beyond the mirror was alive. She told Robert the next morning, but he dismissed it as imagination. Days later, he saw it too. While cleaning his boots in front of the mirror, he noticed the reflection of the window behind him. In the glass, the curtains stirred, as if a breeze had passed through. But in the room itself, the air was still. The movement was only in the reflection. Word spread among relatives, and soon neighbors gathered to see for themselves. Some claimed they saw shapes moving in the glass, long and thin, gliding past as though walking down a corridor unseen. Others said the mirrors grew colder to the touch at night, the wood damp with moisture as though breathing. One boy swore he placed his hand near the surface and felt a vibration, faint like the hum of distant bees. Professor Kincaid heard of the mirrors and visited the McClintock home. His notes described them as ordinary objects of glass and oak. Yet, he admitted that while watching, he saw what appeared to be a shimmer, like heat rising from stone. He wrote that the mirrors might be more than furniture, that they could serve as a boundary. His words were precise. Not a reflection, but a passage. The McClintocks grew increasingly frightened. They covered the mirrors with cloth, but the strange effects continued. At night, the family claimed to hear muffled voices drifting from beneath the cloth, indistinct but human in tone. Ellen described them as whispers, sometimes soft, sometimes urgent, always just beyond recognition. The most chilling moment came one evening in May. Ellen uncovered one mirror during the day to dust it. As she leaned close, she swore she saw not her own face, but the pale outline of Miranda Hollis, the shopkeeper's wife who had vanished months before. The figure was faint, as if trapped behind a wall of water, but unmistakable. Ellen screamed, and when Robert rushed in, the reflection was gone. The mirrors were eventually removed from the house and taken to storage in the county office, where they were locked away. No official record mentions them, but those who saw them firsthand never forgot. The McClintock family never placed another mirror in their home, choosing instead to live without them. The tale of the mirrors spread quickly, adding another layer to the dread already surrounding Shannon County. It was one thing for the forest and caves to swallow people whole. It was another for ordinary objects inside a home to carry signs of the vanished. The mirrors suggested something far worse. The mystery was not only outside, it was everywhere. By the summer of 1904, Shannon County had grown used to fear. Families had changed their routines, locking themselves inside before sunset, avoiding Baker's Hollow, and whispering about the caves that seemed to breathe. Yet one cave in particular had long carried a reputation darker than the rest. Locals called it the Blowing Cave. The cave earned its name from the constant draft that poured from its mouth. No matter the season, a cold wind rushed outward, carrying with it a smell that no one could quite describe. Some said it was the scent of damp stone. Others claimed it was closer to rot. Few dared to linger long enough to decide. Professor Jonathan Kincaid, however, was determined to explore it. He convinced 2 men, brothers named Aaron and Luke Miller, to guide him to the site. Both were loggers, hardened by years of work in the hills, but even they hesitated at the entrance. The cave mouth yawned like a wound in the limestone, the draft carrying a steady hiss that reminded them of something alive, exhaling. Kincaid lit his lantern and stepped inside. The brothers followed reluctantly, their boots scraping against the stone floor. The passage widened into a chamber that twisted downward, walls slick with moisture. The air grew colder with every step. Within minutes, their breath clouded in front of them, though outside the summer heat still pressed heavy. The deeper they went, the stronger the wind became. It howled through narrow fissures, creating tones that rose and fell like voices. Aaron swore he heard his name carried on the draft. Luke claimed he heard a woman crying. Kincaid wrote later that the sounds were not imagination. They were structured, layered, almost like chanting. The men soon discovered markings along the walls. They were not carvings, nor the claw marks Kincaid had seen in other caves. These were circular patterns, etched into the limestone itself, perfectly smooth as though burned or dissolved. The circles overlapped, forming designs that seemed deliberate, though no one could guess their meaning. Kincaid traced them with his fingers and felt a faint vibration, as though the stone itself was humming. Then they found something worse. At the far end of the chamber lay bones, not animal bones, scattered as one might expect from predators, but human remains. A partial skeleton, the skull cracked, the ribs splayed open. The bones were old, brittle, but not ancient. The brothers backed away in terror, insisting they leave immediately. Kincaid forced himself to sketch the scene, noting the placement of the remains and the strange black residue that stained the stone around them. The men fled the cave, stumbling into the sunlight pale and shaken. They swore never to return, warning others that the blowing cave was cursed. Kincaid, however, could not let it rest. His notes were precise. He described the cave as a place of convergence, where air, sound, and death came together. He wrote that the wind itself seemed to carry voices, and that the patterns on the walls marked it as more than a natural formation. News of the discovery spread quickly. Families already fearful of the woods now avoided every limestone opening. Children were forbidden to play near cave mouths, and hunters refused to set traps within sight of them. The blowing cave became a name spoken in whispers, another piece of evidence that something beyond human understanding haunted the Ozark Mountains. The official records never acknowledged the discovery of bones, and some doubted Kincaid's account. But for those who believed, the cave was proof that the vanishings were not accidents. They were part of something larger, something tied to the land itself. By the end of summer, Shannon County was not only haunted by silence and disappearances, it was haunted by the knowledge that deep beneath their feet, the caves were not empty. They were waiting. By late summer of 1904, Professor Jonathan Kincaid had spent nearly 5 months in Shannon County. He had walked the trails where Elias Woodward's journal was found, traced the road where Dr. Hawthorne's watch lay in the dust, and studied the abandoned sled of the Thornton brothers. He had seen the strange handprint near the path of Miranda Hollis, and he had descended into the blowing cave where bones lay hidden in the dark. For weeks, the professor filled his notebooks with sketches, observations, and fragments of testimony. He recorded the weather on the nights of each disappearance, the phases of the moon, and the directions in which echoes carried in Baker's Hollow. He noted details most had ignored, such as the number of hours between each vanishing and the way the sites aligned roughly in a circle around the hollow itself. At first, Kincaid shared little of his findings. He preferred to work alone, scribbling by lamplight in the small room he rented above the tavern. But as the summer dragged on and whispers in town grew louder, he began to gather a small audience of men who were willing to listen. One evening in August, Kincaid spread his field notes across a tavern table. A half-dozen locals leaned close as he pointed to a map of Shannon County. He marked the sites one by one: Elias to the north, Hawthorne to the west, the Thornton brothers to the east, Miranda to the south. The pattern was clear, he said. They formed a perfect cross with Baker's Hollow at the center. The men shifted uneasily, muttering prayers under their breath. Kincaid went on, showing sketches of the claw marks he had found in the caves, the circles etched into the limestone, and the strange symbols that seemed burned into the stone itself. He explained how the sounds carried differently in the hollow, how voices seemed to linger longer than they should, and how the silence pressed against him in ways no natural silence ever could. When one man asked if he believed the disappearances were the work of outlaws or wild animals, Kincaid shook his head firmly. His notes ruled out both. There were no tracks, no blood trails, and no signs of robbery. What he described instead was more unsettling. He told them the disappearances were not random. They were chosen. The word sent a chill through the room. Chosen meant intelligence. Chosen meant purpose. Kincaid leaned forward, his voice low but steady, and said that something in the Ozark woods was aware of them. It was not accident or misfortune. It was selection. The men argued in hushed tones. Some rejected his claims outright, demanding he stop before spreading panic further. But others admitted what they had long feared. They had heard the cries in the night, seen flickering lights in the trees, and felt the weight of silence pressing on their homes. Kincaid's words only gave shape to what they already believed. In his journals, Kincaid summarized the moment. They know we are here. They choose who to take. The pattern is deliberate. The hollow is the heart. From that night forward, the community was split. A few placed faith in Kincaid's reasoning, convinced that knowledge might protect them. Others condemned him, claiming his obsession would only draw more misfortune. But no one could ignore the evidence he had laid bare. By the close of summer, fear in Shannon County was no longer only about what had happened. It was about what might come next. And, thanks to Kincaid's notes, the people now believed the disappearances were not the end of a story. They were only the beginning of something far larger. By September of 1904, Professor Jonathan Kincaid had become both respected and feared in Shannon County. To some, he was a man of reason, someone who had given structure to the chaos that haunted the valley. To others, he was a provocation, a scholar who poked too deeply into matters better left undisturbed. He carried his notebooks everywhere, thick with sketches and observations, and spoke with a confidence that both reassured and unsettled. But then, without warning, the professor himself became part of the story. On the morning of September 12th, Kincaid was seen leaving the tavern, satchel over his shoulder, lantern in hand. He told the innkeeper he was heading toward Baker's Hollow one last time. Witnesses remembered his words clearly. "If the pattern is to be understood," he said, "the answer lies at the center." When evening fell and he had not returned, the townsfolk grew uneasy. By dawn the next day, a search party set out. They followed the trail into the hollow, calling his name through the mist. Near the old cabin of Elias Woodward, they found signs that Kincaid had passed through. His footprints were clear in the damp soil, steady and purposeful, leading deeper into the valley. And then, as had happened before, the tracks ended. They did not fade, scatter, or wash away. They ended abruptly in a patch of earth untouched by wind or rain. His satchel lay nearby, its strap torn, as though it had been ripped from his shoulder in a single violent motion. Inside were his notebooks, pages filled with notes about the hollow. The final entry, written hastily, chilled those who read it. "The sound is above me now. It moves like breath through the trees. They are closer than ever." The searchers pressed on, lanterns trembling in their hands. They found nothing else. No body, no blood, no struggle, only silence that grew heavier the deeper they went. When they returned to town empty-handed, the community broke once more. The man who had come to explain the vanishings had vanished himself, leaving behind only words that deepened the dread. Some believed he had fallen victim to the same force that had taken the others. Others whispered he had gone willingly, lured by whatever intelligence he claimed was choosing its victims. The official record was brief, as it had been for the others: missing, presumed dead. But unlike Elias Woodward or Miranda Hollis, Kincaid left behind a body of work. His journals remained in the county office, guarded by men who did not know whether to fear or revere them. To this day, those notes describe the hollow as if it were alive, aware, and waiting. The disappearance of Professor Kincaid marked the peak of terror in Shannon County. For months, the people had clung to the hope that his reasoning might bring answers, that knowledge might drive out fear. Instead, knowledge had been swallowed along with the man who sought it. By the end of September, no one dared enter Baker's Hollow again. Families avoided the ridge entirely, detouring for miles rather than pass near it. The community learned to live with the unanswered questions, for they no longer believed answers could be found. The forest had claimed the trapper, the physician, the loggers, the shopkeeper's wife, and now the scholar. And with each victim, the message grew clearer. Whatever haunted the Ozark woods did not discriminate. It only chose. By the autumn of 1904, Shannon County was a hollowed community. In less than a year, 6 men and 1 woman had vanished. The last to go was Professor Jonathan Kincaid, the outsider who had tried to bring reason to the chaos and instead had been taken himself. After his disappearance, no one in the county dared to speak openly of Baker's Hollow. To many, it became a place erased from maps in their minds. Yet, silence did not erase memory. The years that followed saw families move away, abandoning cabins and farmland that had been worked for generations. Those who stayed clung to their homes but lived with constant unease. They built fences closer, avoided the trails that cut through the ridges, and taught their children rules that sounded less like wisdom and more like superstition. Never walk alone. Never follow lights between the trees. Never step into the hollow, not even in daylight. Kincaid's journals remained, gathering dust in the county office. Officials treated them as curiosities, strange notes written by a man who had lost his way. But among the locals, the journals took on the weight of prophecy. His words about silence that pressed like breath, about sounds that circled from every direction, about presences that chose their victims, became part of the folklore of the valley. For decades afterward, hunters swore they heard cries echoing in the hollow, cries that were not animal and not human. Farmers told of cattle that refused to graze near its edge, bellowing in terror until driven elsewhere. Travelers described hearing footsteps following them along the ridge, though when they turned, no one was there. In the 1930s, a group of spelunkers ventured into the caves near the hollow. They returned pale and shaken, refusing to speak of what they had seen. One of them, years later, admitted they had found markings in the stone that matched the sketches in Kincaid's notes. Another claimed they heard voices whispering their names in the dark. The group never attempted a second expedition. Even into the 20th century, the legend endured. Children whispered dares to approach the hollow after dark, though few were foolish enough to try. Hunters left offerings of tobacco or bread at the tree line, hoping to appease whatever lingered there. And families who lived closest still left lanterns burning through the night, a ritual passed down through generations. The mystery of the vanishings was never solved. No bodies were recovered, no answers recorded. Only the chilling evidence remained. A journal, a watch stopped at 5:17, an abandoned sled, a handprint pressed into frozen snow, a pair of mirrors that shimmered with shadows, and a set of field notes written by a man who vanished into his own map of fear. The Ozark Mountains remain a place of wild beauty, their hills rising in endless waves of forest and stone. But for those who know the stories, the beauty hides something older and hungrier, something that watches, something that waits. To this day, locals tell newcomers the same warning: do not walk alone into Baker's Hollow, do not follow the lights, and above all, do not listen if the silence begins to breathe. The legacy of fear lives on, carried in whispered warnings, in journals kept locked away, and in the shadows of a valley that has never forgotten. The Ozark woods keep their secrets, but the people who live in their shadow know the truth. Once the forest chooses, it never gives back. This has been the story of the unsolved mysteries that began in 1903 and still haunt the Ozark Mountains. A century has passed, yet the fear has never faded. Some places hold their secrets too tightly, and some silences speak louder than screams. If this story unsettled you, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next horrifying account. Share this with someone who believes legends are harmless tales, and let them decide if they would dare to walk alone into the Ozark woods. Because even now, the ridges are waiting, the caves are breathing, and the silence has not ended.